Hi again, Len Rydell, presenting the second lecture on the second day's fighting at Gettysburg from our June 1996 symposium and tour at the Eisenhower Inn in Gettysburg. This speaker, I can't say enough nice things about him, so I'm going to try to be really concise in this. Terry Winschel, first and foremost, is the most genteel and nicest man I have ever met in my life. He is absolutely a rock solid gentleman and uh, soft spoken, but knows his material extremely well, well trained. He was the chief historian at the Vicksburg National Military Park and was the man who succeeded Ed Bars. There might have been somebody in between the two of them, but Terry was the historian of Vicksburg for, I want to say, 30 plus years. And in that time, there was nobody that gave a better canned park briefing than Terry did. I mean, he was well versed. You will have seen him. He did a first person of a Confederate soldier in butternut uniform that we've used as a renewal image in our veteran volunteer force for more than 20 years because he just looks so Southern and so Confederate and such a common soldier in that picture that it just made very well for what I was trying to do and getting people to renew for the organization. But Terry, of course, in working at the Park Service, had access to all of the wonderful archives that Ed put together. He also, with years and years and years of experience in watching the park grow and so forth, knew where all the monuments were, knew where all the interpretive plates were, including the old ones, the cast iron ones that went back and forth. He had plenty of time that he could research the wartime appearance of battlefield, and the Vicksburg campaign and the battlefield really was a field that was generally stripped of its foliage, as the Confederates uh, under Colonel Smith, who had been the engineer for the Vicksburg defenses, uh, had stripped their fields of fire and everything. And then it's very rare. Now at Vicksburg, Terry did get some limited opportunity to attempt to restore the battlefield at Vicksburg to what it looked like at the siege, but ultimately he was never going to get away with tearing down all those trees with all the tree huggers and alligator kissers and everything. It just too many too many places. He did succeed in making the argument that by restoring the field to its natural appearance, that he made it more possible for nature to be what nature was, because so many of these trees and so forth were providing cover for birds of prey like hawks and eagles and so forth that were looking for their prey. And with lots and lots of ground foliage and stuff there, the food that the uh, ecosystem needed wasn't readily available. And so he did win that for a short period of time until people found out what cold cutting a hill would actually result in. And so Terry did get some of the stuff done at Vicksburg, but not all of it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case might be, and it wasn't this way at the time we did this program, but at the same time Terry was doing that, there was a move within the Park Service to try to restore some of these primary battlefields to looking like they looked like at the time of the battle. And the most success for that has been done both at Gettysburg and at Antietam in the Eastern Theater, which both look remarkably like they looked like at the time of the battle, with the exception of Antietam's east woods and west woods not quite being as dense as they used to be, and they also have to replant the north woods at Antietam. So there was a period of time in which they were trying to do that, and Terry was right in the middle of all of that. He also was involved in the reclamation of the Pemberton's headquarters, which was in downtown Vicksburg. And if you ever had the good fortune of being on a program with Terry Winschel, you were going to get a very rock solid presentation, and you were going to know and feel that you were in the hands of total competence in what you were doing. So bringing Terry up to Pennsylvania to talk about the continuation of the fighting of the Mississippians primarily, as the En Echelon attack, which had started with Hood against Big Round Top, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, now spilled over to the Rose Farm, the Peach Orchard, the Trossel Barn, and up to and including Seminary Ridge, which a great many people don't realize the Confederates actually crested and occupied Cemetery Ridge the day before Pickett's charge. Their attack had spun out and they couldn't hold it in the late hours of the evening, but it just goes to show the manner in which Lee was attempting to control this rear portion. You know, some people call it the Federal left. I like to say I think because of the way the Federals arrived at the field, that the Federals were putting people like Sickles not on their left but on their rear. Those who subscribe to the fishhook theory, with Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill being the shank of the hook, the curved hook of the fish hook, and the Little Round Tops being the top of the hook, then the perception is that this was a turning of the Federal left, whereas I believe because Meade was looking to the north and his men were ensconced on the northern slopes of Cemetery Hill and so forth, and other people then went into encampment in the rear. I believe, in its semantics, but I believe that the Federals, in fact, or the Confederates were in fact trying to get behind the Federal Army. And so this was not turning the Federal left, but it was getting in their rear. 6 of one, half dozen the other, but it may affect how you interpret the battle. So that's something you'll have to think about for yourself. But with Parker's presentation, Parker had dealt with that fight all the way through the wheat field, which was a full day of fighting in and of itself, but yet some of the most poignant pictures that come out of the Battle of Gettysburg that you have seen in Bill Frazanito's books and other pictures of the Battle of Gettysburg, most of the dead there are the dead from the Rose Farm. It was a long stretch of land on the east side of the Emmitsburg Road, and it formed a basis for the Confederates to move parallel to the road, and then from the other side of the road, near where the Eisenhower, if you haven't been there before, there's an Eisenhower observation post where Dwight Eisenhower used to take visitors up there to look over the battlefield as he'd walk people around in his post-presidency years. But the Confederate attack in echelon started from the right, had extended to the right, and then just kind of swept around and moved itself up against the Federal position, which was in front of and on top of Seminary Ridge, south of the main Federal position on Cemetery Hill and Ziegler's Grove and East Cemetery Hill. So Terry is going to pick up that conversation and take this through the cresting and the end of the fight of Longstreet on the second day at Gettysburg. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Terry Winschel as he talks about the fighting for the Peach Orchard and the Trossel Barn and Seminary Ridge. We're going to do a shot of it she does with the arms, and then Mike Miller. We'll work it. Yeah. You'll love it. Mike, do you know it? Mike's going to do Seven Access. John Tennessee and Parker's going to be Shiloh. Shiloh will be in early April and Seven Access will be in August. First week of April. Thing people have to do when they come to a battlefield is to imagine the immensity of a battlefield and what it really entails and how a fight unfolds. Last night we spoke a little bit, and I tried to give you some sense of how large these armies were and the amounts of people that are involved. As you go out to the battlefield today and you look at the fighting that Longstreet's men did, and you look at how this entire serpentine type of arrangement is set up, I think you'll really be astonished at just the depth of that fighting. So in laying things out, when Parker and our next speaker, Terry Winschel, got together, they sat down, and just as the fighting itself unfolded, they too have built a program that one builds from the other. We have now taken you through the fighting at the wheat field, which in and of itself is one heck of a day's work. It certainly is a day's work for John Bell Hood and the other men who have had to deal with that. And as a point of recommendation to you, because some people have asked me on this, many of the books that we put up there are all specifically selected for their relevance to what you're experiencing right now. Probably one of the finest reminiscences, although it is very expensive tragically, but one of the finest reminiscences and descriptions of that fighting that you will ever find written anywhere in your life is William C. Oates' book, Reminiscence of the War Between the North and the South, or the Union, I forgot the precise name of it, which we have over there. So if you want more information about that fighting within that area, that certainly is a first-hand account that's written by that. And then also the two books by Harry Fonz, who was the chief historian of the National Park Service before Ed. They are absolutely chock-a-block full of detail on this fighting that we're talking about, and are very, very readable, very comprehensive. So that maybe will help you sort out from some of the what is important and what's not important. That's how we selected those books. I've read all the books that I've recommended to you, and there's not a book up there that I am personally disappointed in terms of its relevance to what you're picking up here. Our second speaker today is probably best known for being the chief historian of one of the major military parks in the country, Vicksburg National Military Park. Terry Winschel is not just the chief historian there. He is literally a friend to everybody who has ever met him, and to those people who he works with in Gray's Tale in Mississippi. He has been a key force within the Delta, worked with the state of Louisiana and Mississippians in the Deep Delta Initiative, which was an effort to map all the Civil War sites in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi,
Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky,
Missouri, and so forth. All of this, and Terry was deeply involved in helping with that. But in prepping himself to go to Vicksburg, in fact, Terry was a historian here at Gettysburg National Military Park. So if you talk about absolutely falling into a place and falling into a job that you would love, I can't think of two better assignments in the National Park Service than to start at Gettysburg and then go to Vicksburg and to live with both of those. Terry is only an enemy to those people who write inadequate scholarship. And I remember one time, I'll tell this story about Terry. Parker and I were going to visit Terry a couple of years ago down at the park. And Terry, who you have never in your life heard say a bad word. I mean, he could find something good to say about Saddam Hussein. Terry picks up this book, and Parker walks in and says, "How you doing, Terry?" He says, "I can't believe I've got to read this trash." And he threw it down, and it was a book that, can we recommend it to people? What was it? It was Guy McFarland published that.
It makes very good kindling.
It's good kindling. He said this thing has 30-some odd errors of fact right from the start. And he just pitched the thing down, and it was without a doubt the most damning book review I have ever read in my life. But it speaks tons and tons to the intellectual purity and the convictions that Terry has as a historian in bringing the truth to you.
Terry is a graduate of Penn State University, and from there he has actually deceived many Mississippians into believing that he's one of them. But he does come back up here. He took people out yesterday and described to them Scrabble and how and where you should eat Scrabble. Incidentally, good Mississippians looked at him and said, "Who the hell are you kidding?" And he said, "Bring me some grits." With that, please join me in welcoming Terry Winschel.
Thanks, Lance. And good morning, everyone. Although honored by your kind invitation to be here this morning, I'm more deeply honored by your presence, and I thank you for this opportunity to share our love of history with one another. As a native Pennsylvanian, former employee at Gettysburg National Military Park, I'm especially pleased to be back here in Vicksburg of the East. Now, for my dear friends from Mississippi who came up with us yesterday, if you want some good grits, the Lincoln Diner on Steinmar Avenue is the best place in town. For any of you who want to try grits for the first time, I highly recommend that as well. My program today, as you've seen from the outline, goes into far greater detail than just the action on the second day. It is hoped that by doing this, you will come to know that the gallant Mississippians who served here at Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, and at the same time be able to put into proper context the events that Parker, myself, Terry, Tom, Ed, and others will be discussing over the next several days. My program is a lengthy one, for which I do apologize to you ahead of time, so please bear with me if you will. The history of the Magnolia State contains no chapter more glorious than that which chronicles the selfless devotion to duty of the citizen soldier of Mississippi. Throughout the history of Mississippi, the servicemen and women of the Magnolia State have answered the call to duty with dignity and honor, regardless of the sacrifice. During the conflict which raged from 1861 to 1865, soldiers from Mississippi demonstrated a constancy of bravery and courage that has seldom been equaled, never excelled. Their service, as one veteran wrote, is part and parcel of the heirloom that Mississippi handed down to her sons. The Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, contained 11 regiments of infantry, 1 battery of artillery, and 1 battalion of cavalry from Mississippi. This brief study will focus on the infantrymen from the Magnolia State who participated in the Pennsylvania campaign, which culminated at Gettysburg. The 11 regiments were divided among 3 brigades, commanded by sons of Mississippi's more distinguished families, William Barksdale, Colonel Posey, and Joseph Davis. The intrepid William Barksdale was an imposing figure. 41 years of age, he was a rather large man, weighing over 200 pounds, and had long white hair. Born in Smyrna, Tennessee, on August 21st, 1821, Barksdale attended the University of Nashville, then studied law in Columbus, Mississippi. Although trained in law, he pursued a career in journalism and edited the pro-slavery Columbus Democrat. Following service in the Mexican War, during which he served as a staff officer in the 2nd Mississippi Infantry, Barksdale returned to the Magnolia State and became active in politics. In 1852, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he quickly became the spokesman for the Southern cause. An outspoken champion of states' rights, he fought as fiercely in Congress as he would later on the fields of battle. On January 12, 1861, shortly after Mississippi seceded from the Union, he resigned his congressional seat and took up the sword. Governor John J. Pettus, a fire eater much like Barksdale, moved quickly to organize the military forces of Mississippi. In the newly organized Army of Mississippi, William Barksdale was appointed Quartermaster General. Staff responsibilities, however, did not sit well with the temperamental Barksdale. According to one Mississippi soldier, the former congressman had a very thirst for battlefield glory. When President Jefferson Davis issued his first call for troops, Mississippi was asked to organize and hold 3,000 troops in readiness. Responding to the President's call, men flocked to the colors, and on May 14, 1861, William Barksdale was elected colonel of the newly organized 13th Regiment of Mississippi Infantry. Colonel Barksdale led the regiment into battle at First Manassas, where he and his men distinguished themselves. On June 29, 1862, at Savage Station, Brigade Commander Richard Griffith was mortally wounded, and Barksdale assumed command. Promoted to Brigadier General in August, he led the Mississippi Brigade at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and in the Chancellorsville campaign. The Pennsylvania campaign, as you know, would be his last. The Mississippi Brigade, commanded by William Barksdale, consisted of 4 regiments, the 13th, 17th, 18th, and 21st, commanded respectively by Colonels James Carter, William D. Holder, Thomas Griffin, and the indomitable Benjamin Rupp Humphreys. Barksdale's Mississippians were attached to Major General Lafayette McLaws' division of General James Longstreet's First Corps. The other 2 Mississippi brigades which participated in the Pennsylvania campaign were in A.P. Hill's Third Corps. Joseph R. Davis, nephew of the Confederate President, commanded a brigade in Major General Harry Peake's division. The 38-year-old brigadier had been born in Woodville, Mississippi on January 12, 1825. Growing up an only child, Davis enjoyed the advantage of being a member of the first family of Mississippi. He received an excellent education in Nashville and went on to graduate from the University of Oxford in Ohio. Returning to Mississippi, he practiced law in Madison County, but as the nation drifted closer toward war, he entered politics. In 1860, he was elected to the Mississippi Senate, where his voice was raised in many eloquent appeals in behalf of state rights. Upon the secession of Mississippi, Davis helped raise a company of infantry known as the Madison Rifles and was elected captain. Shortly after, he was elected lieutenant colonel of the 10th Infantry. On May 20, 1861, he was ordered to Montgomery, and from there to Richmond, where he joined the staff of his uncle. Joseph Davis continued on the President's staff for more than a year, during which time he was promoted to colonel and nominated as a brigadier general. The nomination, however, was rejected. Nominated a second time, Davis was confirmed by the Senate only after charges of nepotism were fully discussed. He was commissioned a brigadier for rank from September 15, 1862. The newly commissioned brigadier assumed command of 3 Mississippi regiments, the 2nd, 11th, and 42nd. The brigade was later augmented by the addition of the 55th North Carolina Infantry, whose actions we shall see later on the field today. The transition from staff officer to brigade commander were no doubt difficult for Davis, but eased somewhat by the fact that 2 of his regiments were veteran units of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The Mississippian developed into a solid combat officer and was destined to lead the brigade until the inevitability of Appomattox would end the greatest struggle in American history. The Davis Brigade, as one veteran boasted, was notorious for their gallantry and discipline and attracted the admiration and commendation of the Army and its commanding general. Davis's Mississippians were commanded by Colonels John Marshall Stone, Francis M. Green, and Hugh Reed Miller, names all well familiar with the Mississippi contingent here off to my left. The North Carolinians attached to the brigade were commanded by Colonel John Kerr Conley. On the battlefield at Gettysburg, this brigade was destined to suffer greater loss than any other brigade in Lee's army. The men of Brigadier General Colonel Posey's brigade complete the Mississippi contingent, which served with Lee's army during the Great Invasion. Posey, just as with Davis, was a native of Wilkinson County, born near Woodville on August 5, 1818. Carno, the second son of John Brooks Posey and Elizabeth Sarabin, received a college education in nearby Jackson, Louisiana, and later studied law at the University of Virginia, where he now rests today. Returning to the Mississippi, he busied himself for several years as a gentleman planter at Sligo Plantation. Upon the death of his first wife, Mary Collins, in 1840, Posey became a partner in the lucrative law practice of Colonel George M. Gordon and established a reputation of high standards. At the outbreak of the war with Mexico, Posey was quick to enlist in the Wilkerson Volunteers, which were later designated as Company B of the 1st Mississippi Rifles. The men from Wilkerson County served under Colonel Jefferson Davis in northern Mexico with old Rough and Ready himself, Major General Zachary Taylor. Their first action came at Monterey, where Lieutenant Posey won special mention in Davis's report. At Buena Vista, where the Mississippians won renown, the young lieutenant was wounded, but continued on duty. His action won honorable mention from Davis and endeared him to the future Confederate president. Colonel Posey was a man of strong conviction and an ardent states' rights Democrat. He closely followed the events which swept the nation in the 1850s and with anxiety watched as the nation drifted closer to civil war. Upon dissolution of the Union and the secession of Mississippi, Posey quickly organized a company of volunteers known as the Wilkerson Rifles. Mustered into service at Woodville on April 12, 1861, the lawyer and Mexican War veteran was elected captain. Later elected colonel of the 16th Mississippi, Posey did not get an opportunity to lead his regiment into battle until the spring campaign of 1862. His first test in battle came in the Battle campaign at Cross Keys, where he proved himself to be a brave and daring officer. He went on to win additional laurels at Second Manassas, Harper's Ferry, and at Antietam. His actions were exceptional, and he was listed by General James Longstreet among the officers most prominently distinguished in these engagements. On November 1st, 1862, he was promoted to brigadier and given command of the Mississippi Brigade, formerly commanded by Lieutenant Scott Featherston. The brigadier from Mississippi was a tall, slender, and strikingly handsome man whose coal black hair and beard and dark, piercing eyes made him conspicuous in uniform. His brigade consisted of the 12th, 16th, 19th, and 48th Mississippi regiments, commanded by Colonel William Taylor, Samuel Baker, Nate Harris, and Joseph Jane, respectively. His was a disciplined, efficient, and hard-fighting brigade that anxiously awaited battle with their old foe, the Army of the Potomac. Thus we can see at all levels of command, Lee's Mississippians were led by experienced and capable officers. Their combat records were impressive and a source of tremendous pride to the officers and men of each brigade. Their morale on the eve of the great invasion was superb. They were destined for glory at Gettysburg, a glory that would cost the very flower of Mississippi manhood. The Pennsylvania campaign that we are here to study began on June 3, 1863, as legions clad in butternut and gray began a march from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Lee's objectives were to move the area of operations out of war-torn Virginia, gather much-needed supplies of food, clothing, and medicine for his army, which were available in the north, capture the Pennsylvania state capital of Harrisburg, and threaten both Philadelphia and Washington. Such a bold move, it was hoped, would loosen Grant's hold on Vicksburg. Most important, victory on northern soil may secure the long-sought foreign recognition from England and France. Heading west from Fredericksburg, the line of march led the army down the Shenandoah Valley, across the Potomac River, into Maryland, and over the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania. As the different brigades from Mississippi swung into the road, one veteran recalled there was in the rank and file that buoyancy of spirit, firmness of purpose, and self-confidence characteristic of an invading and hitherto invincible army. In morale, it was unsurpassed, and except in point of equipment, a stronger and more reliable force, numerically considered, never existed. Many of the Mississippians made their first bivouac of the campaign on the former battlefield at Chancellorsville. Several took advantage of the opportunity to explore the field, seeing Franklin Lafayette Riley of the Westville Guards, Company B, 16th Mississippi Infantry, recorded the ghastly sights in his diary. Some of us went over part of the field, he wrote. The breastworks are so powerful that we wonder how we were able to drive the Yankees from them. Many of them lie unburied. Partly buried bodies, weather-beaten pieces of equipment lie scattered under bushes and trees, in the runs almost everywhere. The scene is terrible, depressing. I didn't spend much time on the field. I didn't want to. Another Mississippian, recalling the fury of Chancellorsville, wrote with deference, "The recollections of that terrible battle were yet fresh in our minds, and as we spread our blankets under the sheltering trees for rest, there came a fluttering, a floating from around the notes of the disturbed whippoorwill, causing many of us to refrain from mirth and jesting out of place. Each of us could recall a friend or relative who had gone down in that fierce engagement only a few weeks before. The very place seemed hallowed by their memory, and we reverently invoke their departed spirits and recall to mind their virtues and gallantry." The weather was hot as the march northward began. The roads were dusty. Although the march was leading, men began to fall from the ranks. Riley noted, "Heat has caused a number of cases of sunstroke. The road is lined with discarded blankets and jackets. An occasional shower did little to relieve the heat, but the march continued at a leisurely pace." As they entered the valley and turned north, the soldiers began to speculate as to their destination. One Mississippian confided his queries to his diary. "Now, where are we heading?" he wrote. "Sharpsburg, Washington City, back to Harper's Ferry?" He then commented, "Wherever we are going, we are covering a lot of territory." Days later, Frank Riley scribbled in his diary, "We have learned where we are headed. General Lee is taking the war to the north, to Maryland, Pennsylvania, and then as far east as we can march." One soldier went so far as to write that we are on our way to Boston, in the middle of the infantry. J.J. Wilson of the Post Brigade also noted that the Army is en route for Maryland or Pennsylvania, and predicted, if so, we will have a good deal of hard fighting. Regardless of where they were heading, it was clear to the soldiers from Mississippi that the summer campaign promises activity. Continuing down the valley, many of the Mississippians passed through Charlestown. James J. Kirkpatrick of the 16th Mississippi observed, "The roadside in many places was adorned by the fair ones, apparently glad to see the boys in gray. He boasted, our bands never failed to do our best." One soldier recalled that the men moved through the town with our usual display, banners flying, bands playing, our arms at the right shoulder shift. To the great amusement of his troops, as the dashing figure of Colonel Posey came into view, the women of Charlestown caused the general to dismount and then kissed him repeatedly on the cheeks. After crossing the Potomac River, several regiments from Mississippi pushed through Sharpsburg. Vivid reminders of the fierce engagement that took place in September 1862 could be seen everywhere. "Although the battle took place 9 months ago," wrote one Mississippian, "signs of the conflict are still visible. The low mounds which cover some of the bodies of those who fell, the furrowed ground and scarred trees, the rails that replaced the fences that were destroyed, all speak of the battle." Another soldier noted more ominously that there were few signs of sympathy since we crossed the river. Upon reaching Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, one soldier observed, "The citizens looked very coldly at us." Another noted, "The Pennsylvanians seemed to like us even less than did the Marylanders. The women were especially hostile and taunted them with cries of traitors. They also made fun of their ragged appearance, to which one Mississippian responded, 'Be jabbers, we always put on our dirty clothes when we go hog killing.'" The soldiers from Mississippi rested for several days in the vicinity of Chambersburg. Forage details were sent into the surrounding countryside and returned with an abundance of foodstuffs. War, however, was ever present on their mind, and in the closing days of June, the men could sense events beginning to move rapidly. Lee's army was poised for a strike against Harrisburg. In fact, his advanced units were already within a few miles of Pennsylvania's capital. "Morale is high," recorded one Mississippian. the men anxiously awaited orders to move and were confident that victory in Pennsylvania would result in Southern independence. The familiar sounds of reveille shattered the morning stillness on Wednesday, July the 1st, 1863, as it reverberated through the camps and faded in the distance. The men awoke, wet and sore, slowly rolled their blankets, then kindled fires to prepare breakfast. Instantly, the fields were full of the sound of an army coming to life. The blowing of bugles, the beating of drums, the voice of the sergeant calling company roll, and the clanking of cooking utensils. A light rain fell as the first light of day appeared in the eastern sky. The men finished their rations and prepared for the day's march. Shortly the order rang out, "Fall in!" And within minutes, the various regiments assumed their position in line, and the long gray column moved out. Their destination, Gettysburg. You are all familiar with the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, how the three-day action would engulf the entire area around the small village. The first day of battle, of course, would be fought here north and west of town, as the Confederate legions under A.P. Hill will clash with Union troops along McPherson Ridge. Driving the Federals through the streets of town, the Union Army would take up a strong defensive position here on the hills, south and east of town, and it is here where the battles on July 2nd and 3rd will be fought. The march began promptly at 5 a.m. on July 1st, with Major General Harry Keith's division in the lead. Brigadier General Joseph R. Davis's brigade was second in the column and marched on Gettysburg with only 3 of its 4 regiments. The officers and men of the brigade probably did not hear the opening shot of the great battle. The first indication they had that the enemy was near was a flurry of activity to the front as the lead brigade deployed a heavy line of skirmishers south of the road. Davis threw forward skirmishers and assumed a corresponding position north of the road, roughly 3 miles west of Gettysburg. The town of Gettysburg came into view as the Confederate skirmish line pushed over Belmont Schoolhouse Ridge. Upon reaching the crest of the ridge, Keith scanned the countryside with his field glasses, but could find no opposing line of battle. Satisfied with the situation, Keith ordered Davis and Brigadier General James J. Archer to deploy their brigades and move forward to occupy the town. The Mississippians and North Carolinians in martial array with lines neatly dressed in flags unfurled presented a magnificent appearance and made their brigadiers swell with pride. The line stretched for more than 400 yards with man touching man, each of whom was determined to do his duty. The soldiers, recalled one man in the ranks, realizing the magnitude of resistance, nerved themselves for the arduous task, and with that inimitable rebel yell, rushed forward. Davis's brigade was concentrated north of the unfinished railroad as it advanced up McPherson Ridge. His men were thus protected on the right by the railroad-filled and traversed Willoughby Run. The Mississippians and North Carolinians were able to apply unrelenting pressure on Brigadier General John Buford's Union cavalry, and the blue line started to give way. It was close to 10:30, and the Confederates seemed on the verge of success when the battle-ready infantrymen of the Army of the Potomac arrived on the field. This is the situation north and west of Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, 1863. You see the railroad running out from town. This is a map that you don't have in your handout. I'm sorry to say. As Davis's skirmishers neared the crest of West McPherson Ridge, their attention quickly focused on the long column and Union infantrymen crossing the Chambersburg Pike on the run. The advancing foe were 3 regiments of Brigadier General Lysander Cutler's brigade, with the 76th New York in the lead, followed by the 56th Pennsylvania and the 147th New York. The skirmishers in gray immediately opened fire on the lead regiment as it deployed into line of battle and maintained a steady fire with telling effect. Moments later, Davis's main line swept over the ridge and closed with the enemy. The engagement soon became very warm, wrote Davis. After a short contest, the order was given to charge and was promptly obeyed. In In this initial phase of the battle, Davis's brigade crushed the Federal right, captured one gun and limber, and inflicted more than 500 casualties on the enemy. In the excitement of victory, the Southerners pushed toward Seminary Ridge in pursuit of Cutler's shattered regiment. At this critical moment, in the opening day of battle here at Gettysburg, Davis lost control of his brigade, and the pursuit quickly became disorganized. 2 of his 3 regimental commanders were down, and the pursuit was directed by exuberance more so than by discipline. These wildly cheering troops were oblivious to a situation ripe for disaster. Their vision clouded by victory, as by the thick smoke of battle, few of Davis's men saw the troops which fired the devastating volley which ripped unexpectedly into their ranks from the south. The sudden volley was fired by the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, which advanced on the double from Seminary to stem the tide of battle. Bewildered by the deadly fire, the Mississippians and North Carolinians raced for the protection of the railroad cut. Major John A. Blair of the 2nd Mississippi, ranking officer in the cut, attempted to bring order out of chaos in the cut. The Federals, however, advanced inexorably, swept over the post and rail fence lining the pike and charged. The 6th Wisconsin was joined in the attack by the 84th and 95th New York. As the Federal soldiers, these 3 northern regiments advanced, they suffered heavy casualties from Davis's unrelenting and fearfully destructive fire while we're at the edge of the cut in a matter of moments. Shouting, "Throw down your muskets!" the Federals claimed 7 officers and 225 men as prisoners of war. One of the most stirring incidents of the Battle of Gettysburg occurred in a fierce engagement here at the railroad cut as the 2nd Mississippi struggled to hold its colors. William B. Murphy, color bearer for the 2nd Mississippi, recalled the valiant charge of the 6th Wisconsin and the desperate struggle for the colors. "My color guards," he wrote, "were all killed and wounded in less than 5 minutes. And also, my colors were shot more than 12 times, and the flagstaff was hit and splintered 2 or 3 times." Murphy termed it one of the most deadly struggles that was ever witnessed during any battle in a war, and related how the enemy still kept rushing for my flag, and there were over a dozen shot down like sheep in their mad rush for the colors. And as the enemy closed on the cut, Murphy recalled, "A large man brushed for me and the flag. As I tore the flag from the staff, he took hold and my colors." The battered survivors of Davis's brigade fled down West McPherson Ridge and back across Willoughby Run. In addition to those captured in the railroad cut, Davis left behind several hundred dead and wounded soldiers. The brigadier reported his losses as very heavy. He noted that the brigade maintained its position until every field officer, save 2, were shot down, and its ranks were terribly thinned. It was obvious to Heath that from its shattered condition it was not deemed advisable to bring the brigade back into action that day. Davis's shattered regiments were kept on the north side of the Chambersburg pike to collect their stragglers and to rest. At 2:30 p.m., however, the Confederate divisions north, northwest, and west of Gettysburg advanced in an unbroken line which stretched as far as the eye could see. Heath's division, supported by the fresh troops of Major General William Dorsey Pender's division, was ordered forward. Half the soldiers of Davis's brigade were formed on the division's left and advanced up West McPherson Ridge between the railroad and the Chambersburg pike. In this, the climactic struggle of the opening day of battle, the Mississippians advanced with courage and captured several hundred prisoners and the colors of the 149th Pennsylvania. The capture of the banner was but small consolation to the officers and men of Davis's brigade who survived the fighting at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. The Mississippians and North Carolinians had suffered terribly in the day's action, and by 3:30 p.m., the brigade was spent. Heath's other brigades were also spent, but the enemy had been dislodged and driven beyond Gettysburg. Heath reported, after breaking through the first and second lines of the enemy and being out of ammunition, General Pender's division relieved my own and continued the pursuit beyond the town of Gettysburg. Davis, too, shied away from specifics and simply reported the men, being much exhausted by the heat and severity of the engagement, were here resting, and about sunset were ordered to bivouac about 1 mile to the rear. The Army of Northern Virginia had won a stunning victory on July 1st, but it was clear that the victory was far from complete. Anxious to renew the fighting, soldiers clad in butternut and gray marched through the night before the bloody field of battle. During the night, Lee conferred with his chief lieutenants and formulated his battle plans for the morrow. His plan of attack for July 2nd assigned the main effort to Longstreet's 2 divisions then present, those of Major Generals Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood. These hard-hitting divisions were to envelop the enemy's left and drive it in by an attack up the Emmitsburg Road. Destined to play a prominent role in this attack was the Brigade of Mississippians, commanded by William Barksdale. This is one that is in your packet. The veterans of Barksdale's brigade had bedded down near Marsh Creek for the night. These Mississippians reached the front between 9 and 10 o'clock on July 2nd and rested near the seminary buildings throughout the morning hours. Early in the afternoon, a long gray column moved out, and by a circuitous march, moved into position for the attack. The head of the gray column emerged from the woods on Seminary Ridge at 3 o'clock and quickly swung into line of battle. On the Confederate right, Hood unleashed his 4 brigades, which crashed into the Federals on Little Round Top, in Devil's Den, and in the wheat field, the actions that Parker has just described to us. The fighting which resulted was some of the most bitter yet celebrated of the war. Men of both sides fell in large numbers, and the struggle raged unabated for hours. The Mississippians, with McLaw's division, waited impatiently for their turn to strike. The wait was unbearable. Shot and shelled from Union batteries near the peach orchard crashed through the trees and fell among the men. The brigade, however, bore the fire unflinchingly, boasted one Mississippian. One soldier recalled that to relieve the tedium, some strolled down to the little stream in their rear where canteens were filled. Others crossed over and broke off great branches from the numerous cherry trees which were in full bearing. The long wait finally neared an end. Barksdale paced back and forth at the caged line. His initial request to McLaws for permission to seize the battery in his front had been denied. When Longstreet rode up, the impetuous brigadier seized the opportunity and asked his permission to move forward. "I wish you would let me go in, General," said Barksdale. "I would take that battery in 5 minutes." Longstreet replied, "Wait a minute. We are all going in presently." Barksdale called his regimental commanders together and detailed their orders. In parting, he emphasized, "The line before you must be broken. To do so, let every officer and man animate his comrades by his personal presence in the front line." The supreme moment was finally at hand. Barksdale mounted his charger and rode rapidly along the rear of his line. Regimental officers on foot scurried to the front and called their men to attention. Drums beat assembly, and every man in the brigade knew that our turn had finally come. The brigade formed line of battle with the 21st on the right, then the 17th, next came the 13th, and the 18th Mississippi on the left. Barksdale passed around the right, the line rode across the front, and halted in front of the 13th, his old regiment. Soon, Captain G.B. Lamar, Jr., aide-de-camp to McLaws, arrived with the order to advance. Barksdale's face, he wrote, was radiant with joy upon receipt of the order. Lamar wrote of Barksdale, "He was in front of his brigade, hat off, and his long white hair reminded me of the white plume on the bar." William Barksdale addressed his men for the final time. "Attention, Mississippians, battalions, forward," he shouted, then turned toward the enemy and led his men to glory. Longstreet watched as the Mississippi Brigade was ordered to dress to the colors and advance on the foe. The commands were echoed down the line, and the Mississippians swept forward in what has since been known as the grandest charge that was ever seen by mortal man. With glorious bearing, Barksdale sprang to his work. Lamar wrote of the gallant brigadier, "I saw him as far as the eye could follow, still ahead of his men, leading them on." George Clark of Alabama also watched, as Barksdale threw forward his Mississippians in an unbroken line in the most magnificent charge that I witnessed during the war. And led by the gallant Barksdale, who seemed to be 50 yards in his front, the brave boys moved to the advance. Clark wrote of the scene, "It was grand beyond description." The brigade, 1,400 strong, raised the rebel yell as it stepped from Seminary Ridge. Advancing through the orchards and fields, the Mississippians swept forward irresistibly. Union artillery tore gaps in the long gray lines, which were immediately filled. One Northerner recalled, "Nothing we could do seemed to confuse or halt Barksdale's veterans. Nothing daunted Barksdale and his men. They just came on and on and on." The Mississippians maintained a tightly closed and compact line with a front of 350 yards. They approached the Emmitsburg Road between the Shirky buildings on the left and the peach orchard on the right. As they neared the road, Barksdale's men let loose a crashing volley of musketry and closed on the enemy. In a matter of moments, the hard-hitting soldiers from Mississippi overwhelmed the Pennsylvanians defending the road, drove them from their position, and crushed the salient at the peach orchard. Barksdale's men in the process captured scores of prisoners, including Brigadier General Charles Graham, whose brigade was defending the salient. Having gained the high ground along the Emmitsburg Road, Barksdale wheeled 3 of his regiments, the 13th, 17th, and 18th, left up the road. The 21st Mississippi pushed deeper into the peach orchard before it too wheeled to the left. Advancing steadily, the Mississippians were inspired by their commander, who continually urged, "Forward, boys, forward." They slammed into the 114th Pennsylvania near the Shirky House and drove the brightly clad Zouaves before them. Driving additional federal troops in their front, the Mississippi Brigade crossed Crosswell's Lane before it was temporarily halted by the well-directed fire of the 120th New York Infantry. The Mississippians had suffered heavy casualties so far in the advance from Seminary Ridge and along the Emmitsburg Road. Hundreds of men had been killed or wounded, and the line became ragged. One soldier recalled that the men were now covered with dust and blackened with the smoke of battle, with ranks depleted by shot and shell and faint from exhaustion. Colonels Holder and Griffith urged Barksdale to pause and reform the command, but their impetuous commander snapped, "No, crowd them. We have them on the run. Move your regiments." William Barksdale finally rode into the trees along Plum Run and ordered his men forward through the bushes. The Mississippians were met head-on by Colonel George Willard's New York Brigade. The fresh Union troops slammed into the Mississippians with a murderous fire, and at the point of bayonet, the New Yorkers drove Barksdale's men back. Joseph C. Lloyd of the 13th Mississippi heard General Barksdale make a sound and saw men rush to him. The mortally wounded commander of the Mississippi Brigade was taken from his horse and started off the field. In the confusion of the retreat, Barksdale was placed on the ground and left, presumably dead. Lloyd had also been wounded. As he started to the rear, he heard a weak hail to my right, and turning to it, find General Barksdale. The wounded private reached for his canteen to give the general a drink of water, but was disappointed to find that a ball had gone through it and let him out all the water. At Barksdale's insistence, Lloyd reluctantly left him, but promised to send the litter bearers. The private continued to the rear with the firm belief that I was the last man on that part of the field to see General Barksdale alive. The remnant of Barksdale's gallant brigade, now under the command of Colonel Humphreys, fell back in the gathering twilight to the peach orchard, and there bedded down for the night. A glance sufficed to realize the terrible loss the brigade had suffered in just 2 hours of combat. The Mississippians lost not only the intrepid Barksdale, but a catastrophic number of regimental officers and enlisted. Included among the fallen warriors was Captain Isaac Davis Stamps of Company E, 21st Mississippi, another nephew of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. A total of 747 men of the brigade were casualties at Gettysburg, approximately 50% of the men who on the afternoon of July 2nd stepped so lightly from Seminary Ridge with expectations of victory. As the echelon attack that was ordered by General Lee continued to unfold here at Gettysburg on the afternoon of July 2nd, following Barksdale's Mississippian in the attack up the Emmitsburg Road would be the Alabamians at Cadmus Wilcox. We'll see the action, the area of the field in which these troops were engaged later today as Ed tours us around the field. These Alabamians, sweeping the Federals before them, as did Barksdale's Mississippians, would finally be stopped here along the line of Plum Run by the gallant charge of the 1st Minnesota Infantry, again, which Ed will go into great detail today. The attack then continued along the line as Perry's Floridians moved across the Emmitsburg Road and also into the valley of Plum Run. But this is a very small, under-strength brigade that would have very little impact on the action on July 2nd of 1863. It's not until Rand's Wright's Georgians sweep to the attack that this movement against Cemetery Ridge will gain great strength. The Georgians, led by Wright, will sweep across the Emmitsburg Road in the vicinity of the Cadore Farm buildings, push all the way up to the ridge on which the Union soldiers were posted. Advancing on the left of Wright's Georgians would be another brigade of Mississippians, that commanded by Connor Posey. As the veterans of Barksdale's brigade advanced to the front, the Mississippians, commanded by Colonel Posey, also prepared for action. Since noon, elements of his brigade had been engaged in a severe firefight with the enemy for control of the Bliss Farm, situated between the lines. Now, as he prepared his entire brigade to enter the fray, Posey was ordered to advance but 2 of my regiments and deploy them closely as skirmishers, and this will have a significant impact on the action as it unfolds late on the afternoon of July 2nd. So rather than advance his entire brigade of 4 regiments, Posey is simply ordered to advance 2 of his regiments, and that only deployed as skirmishers. So the echelon attack envisioned by Lee will begin to collapse here at this point. Perplexed and somewhat disappointed by the order, Posey quickly advanced the 19th and 48th regiments under Colonels Harris and Jane, respectively. The Mississippians advanced at a double quick, about 250 paces, through a wheat field to a post and rail fence, where members of the brigade manned the skirmish line. There, a tense half-hour passed as the men waited for support to appear on their right. Suddenly, the Georgia Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Ambrose Wright, advanced from Seminary Ridge with steady cadence and came alongside the Mississippians. Without hesitation, Harris shouted to his men in a clear, sharp voice the command, "Forward." He later reported, "I again gave the order to advance, pushing forward my line and driving the enemy from his position in the orchard and capturing some prisoners at the barn." This again is the Bliss barn you see posted on this transparency. Brushing aside the enemy, the Mississippians quickly established themselves as masters of the Bliss farm. A member of the 48th Mississippi on the right of Posey's advance noted that as they endeavored to consolidate their position, which they had orders to do, the Georgians began yelling at them to get up and fight. "Come forward, Mississippians." Frank Foote heard the jibe and recorded the effect was felt, and the entire regiment left its place in the flank and went into action against the earnest efforts of Colonel Jane to stop them. Our adjutant was killed in making the same effort, but everything rushed forward to engage in the charge. Powerless to stem the surging tide of armed men, Harris, Jane, and the other officers from Mississippi moved to direct the impassioned advance. One Mississippian described the moment by writing, "Wild with enthusiasm and ardor, on we pressed with every instant the enemy thundered their shot and shell in our midst. Shells amongst us, shells over us, and shells around us tore our bleeding ranks with ghastly gaps. The gray line swept over the open fields, surged across the Emmitsburg Road and up the gentle slope of Cemetery Ridge, where they closed on the enemy in a fearful clash. Confederate success, however, was short-lived, and the men in gray were driven from the ridge at the point of bayonet. Then came the dreadful part, the most dreadful part of the whole matter, recalled one Mississippian, of falling back across the wide open fields with an exultant enemy thundering at our heels with every contrivance of death. The men streamed back across the fields, leaving behind their dead and wounded, and score of comrades as prisoners of war. And so the echelon attack here at Gettysburg would come to a falter. The Georgians advancing across the field, crossing at the Cadore Farm, would push toward Cemetery Ridge. The Mississippians under Posey, capturing the Bliss Farm, likewise would continue the advance, which is contrary to most published accounts on the Battle of Gettysburg. Sweeping over the Emmitsburg Road, they would assist the Georgians in driving these Federals back from the Emmitsburg Road and capturing a battery of Union artillery in this location and driving all the way up to the angle where finally they would be checked and driven back. The order for the next brigade in line, Mahone's Virginians, never reached the brigadier. As a result, the Virginians did not advance, continuing this echelon attack as envisioned by Lee. And with the repulse of Posey's Mississippians, no further action along this front would enable General Hancock, commander of the Union Second Army Corps, to detach troops from here near the angle and send them to the hard-pressed Federals on Cemetery Hill and in the vicinity of Culp's Hill, helping to repulse Ewell's attack. So had this echelon attack continued along Cemetery Ridge late on the afternoon, early evening on July 2nd, it would be interesting to see what effect that may have had on the overall action at Gettysburg on July 2nd. Posey exerted every effort to rally his scattered commands on the Bliss Farm. Although hampered by darkness, the brigadier reformed his regiment and brought order to his command. Then, under orders, he returned to the shelter of Seminary Ridge with most of his brigade and placed his men in bivouac for the night. The fighting on July 2nd, although of the bloodiest nature, was inconclusive. Lee's army had inflicted thousands of casualties on the enemy, crushed their salient at the Peach Orchard, charged among the guns on Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, and occupied abandoned trenches on Culp's Hill. Yet the Southerners could boast of only partial success. Undaunted, if not encouraged by the day's result, the commanding general believed with proper concert of action and with increased support from the positions gained on the right, would enable the artillery to render the insulting columns, we would ultimately succeed, and it was accordingly determined to continue the attack. On the third and final day of battle, Lee planned to strike directly at the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Friday morning, July 3rd, dawned bright and clear, but quickly became steamy and hot. The Mississippians on the Bliss Farm commenced flying their small arms as soon as it was light enough to discern the Federals on Cemetery Ridge. A member of the 16th Mississippi commented that his comrades shot rather lazily and attributed the rate of fire to the sun being so warm. Their fire, however, was accurate. A Union soldier crouched behind the stone wall near the Bryan barn wrote that the men of his regiment were annoyed by Posey's sharpshooters who were continually dropping shells among us. The Mississippians had become such a nuisance that by 7:30 a.m. several companies of the 12th New Jersey were ordered to clear the troublesome sharpshooters from the Bliss Farms. The Federals quickly seized the house and barn, and in so doing netted one major and 4 enlisted men as prisoners. Having accomplished their mission, the Federals withdrew their lines, whereupon Posey's combative Mississippians immediately reoccupied the buildings and resumed their deadly fire. On Cemetery Ridge, Alexander Hayes reported that the Confederates appeared more pertinacious than in their assault. The fiery Hayes deemed the situation insufferable, and with rage ordered the men of the 14th Connecticut, who were spoiling for a fight, to capture the buildings this day. The Northerners swept across the fields with firm resolve and by sheer determination moved to clear Posey's troublesome men from the farm. Seeing the Federals advance on the run, the Mississippians looked frantically for support, There was no support coming from either the troops in Long Lane or those along Seminary Ridge. The Mississippians hastily withdrew from the Bliss Farm and abandoned to the enemy. Realizing the futility in holding the farm buildings, the Federals applied the torch, then withdrew to Cemetery Ridge. The house and barn were smoldering ruins by 10:30 a.m., and a lull enveloped the field. Although battle would again erupt in fury that afternoon, Posey's men saw no further action, but remained immovable according to orders. Throughout the morning hours on July 3rd, as Posey's Mississippians struggled for control of the Bliss Farm, scores of artillery pieces were wheeled into position along Seminary Ridge and unloaded. Ammunition chests were replenished, and gunners took note of the ranged enemy batteries on Cemetery Ridge. While these preparations were in progress, the infantrymen of Major Generals George Pickett's, Harry Pete's, and James Pettigrew's divisions moved into position. At 1 p.m., 2 guns of the Washington artillery fired the signal for the batteries to hold. Suddenly, the whole Confederate line erupted and hurled solid shot and shell crashing among the Federals from Little Round Top to Cemetery Hill. Colonel E. Porter Alexander, who directed the guns of Longstreet's corps, wrote, "Before the cannonade opened, I had made up my mind to give Pickett the order to advance within 15 or 20 minutes after it began. The cannonade, however, did not have the desired results of driving the enemy artillery from Cemetery Ridge." Alexander continued, "I let the 15 minutes pass, and 20, 25, hoping vainly for something to turn up. The artillery fire continued unabated, and the thick smoke from the guns shrouded the fields. Union gunners, at first reluctant to join the fray, preferring to save their ammunition for the anticipated attack, finally sprang into action and responded with a vengeance. Solid shot and shell went crashing among the trees along Seminary Ridge, sending limbs and fragments of iron cascading among the waiting troops. For hours, the guns fired back and forth, inflicting casualties on the Confederates lined in battle behind the shelter of Seminary Ridge. But finally, after 2 hours of bombardment, the thick smoke from the guns which shrouded the fields and filled the woods with an acrid smell, the guns fell silent. The Federal line, recalled Alexander, was blazing like a volcano. The battle-wise artillerists noted it seemed madness to order in the middle of a hot July day men to undertake an advance of 3/4 of a mile over open ground against the center of that line. But suddenly, the enemy fire slackened. Several pieces of artillery were limbered up and retired. Alexander immediately scribbled a note to Pickett. "For God's sake, come quick," he implored the Virginian. "Come quick, or my ammunition will not let me support you properly." Within minutes, the clarion call of bugles echoed through the woods as commands rained down the line. Thousands of soldiers sprang to attention, shouldered their weapons, and dressed on the colors. Officers unsheathed their swords, and many addressed the troops with words of inspiration. Pettigrew's division emerged from the woods with banners flying. The gray line swept forward in magnificent array. The cannoneers ceased firing and cheered the infantrymen as they advanced beyond the guns. Across the way on Cemetery Ridge, Corporal Christopher Meade of the 12th New Jersey noted, "They made a splendid appearance with their colors flying in the breeze. The spectacle was magnificent," echoed Major Theodore Ellis of the 14th Connecticut. "They advanced in perfect order." Lieutenant Frank Haskell, staff officer in the 2nd Corps, succinctly described the spectacle as being grim, irresistible, yet magnificent. The lines advanced across the fields in perfect cadence. Awed by the sight, Union gunners did not hinder the advance at first. Davis later reported, "Not a gun was fired at us until we reached a strong post and rail fence about 3/4 of a mile from the enemy position, when we were met by a heavy fire of grape and canister and shell, which tore sadly upon our ranks. The enemy's fire ripped through the ranks, destroying all semblance of order. One Mississippian recalled with grief, soon most, if not all, of the field officers were either killed or wounded. No one seemed to be in command. On the left, both Colonel Green and Major Reuben O. Reynolds of the 11th Mississippi were killed. Lieutenant Colonel David W. Humphreys of the 2nd Mississippi was killed, and Colonel 42nd Mississippi was severely wounded and later captured. In the 11th Mississippi alone, one soldier recalled, all the captains and nearly all the lieutenants and non-commissioned officers present were killed, wounded, or captured. Davis was struck with horror to see his men go down in such large numbers, and yet in glaring understatement he simply reported, when within musket's range we encountered a heavy fire of small arms, from which we suffered severely. In the smoke and confusion of battle, the men attempted to maintain order, but to no avail. One Mississippian recorded lines became so shortened and thin as they neared the wall as to be nearly or wholly undiscernible and indistinguishable in the smoke, even nearby, and much more so at a distance. The men advanced singly or in small groups toward the wall. Many of the men were in small clusters around a flag or a junior officer. A member of the brigade declared it had become a soldier's battle in which the Southerners' watchword, the grave or a hero of a victory, was being gloriously exemplified. The gray lines which advanced so splendidly from Seminary Ridge swept across the Emmitsburg Pike and up Cemetery Ridge, where they clashed against the stone wall. In a violent crash of arms, 12 muskets and bayonets were freely used in desperation, as soldiers with unflinching courage struggled to decide the outcome of battle. Davis witnessed the climactic moments and reported that as his men neared the wall, they were subjected to a most galling fire of musketry and artillery that so reduced the already thinned ranks that any further effort to carry the position was hopeless, and there was nothing left to do but to retire to their original position. The angel of death alone can produce such a field as was presented to us, wrote Brigadier General Alexander Hayes of the Army of the Potomac. Captain George Bowen of the 12th New Jersey recalled, the field of battle is a sight never to be forgotten. The dead and wounded lay as thick as one ever saw sheaves of wheat in a harvest field. For a distance of 100 yards or more in front and as far to the right and left as the eye could reach, the bodies of the dead lay in every conceivable shape, in every conceivable posture. He noted perhaps in sympathy, of the thousands that started that day, very few ever returned. Confederate casualties, as you all know, were appalling. Thousands of men were killed or wounded and left upon the field as the remnants of Pickett's, Pettigrew's, and Trimble's command sought shelter on Seminary Ridge. As the survivors of his shattered regiments regrouped west of Seminary Ridge, Davis scanned his losses and wept. Confederate losses at Gettysburg were frightful, as they exceeded 28,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. And with the repulse of his legions on July 3rd, Lee's army had been dealt a crippling blow. After 3 days of brutal, punishing combat, it was clear that further attack would be useless. The time had come for the Army of Northern Virginia to pull back across the Potomac River. The great invasion had failed. On Saturday evening, July 4th, the long gray columns began the withdrawal from Gettysburg. In a torrential rain, the weary soldiers from Mississippi took up a line of march and headed toward the Potomac River. John Berryman Crawford of the 16th Mississippi wrote his wife Margaret several days after the battle, "We have had a hard fight in Pennsylvania." Frank Riley, also of the 16th Mississippi, was more candid as he recorded in his diary, "We didn't win this battle." Perhaps Frank Foote of the 48th Mississippi most clearly stated the reasons for their defeat as he wrote, "In the onset of this march, we were braced by a consciousness of superior valor and a contempt for our foe, which in the end proved our ruin." As the Army headed south, Reverend Thomas Dwight Witherspoon of the 42nd Mississippi expressed the universal feeling of the soldiers from Mississippi as he wrote upon painful reflection, "It was sad to bury our brave men in that hostile land." Lee's army spent an anxious week in the vicinity of Hagerstown and Williamsport, waiting for the swollen river to subside. Tensions rose as the Union Army arrived in the front, and the Mississippians recognized some indications of another battle being at hand. Heavy skirmishing and cannonading were heard at points along the line, but the Army was not discouraged. Frank Riley of Posey's brigade simply noted, slapping mosquitoes, we remained on watch in our works. A pontoon bridge was finally thrown across the river at falling waters, and the Army made good its escape on July the 14th. Thus ended a most stirring campaign, wrote one Mississippian, and the strains that carried me back to old Virginia had more inspiration to us than those of Maryland, my Maryland, to the tune of which we forded the Potomac on the onward march of invasion. The soldiers from Mississippi had indeed crowned themselves with glory at Gettysburg, a glory that cost her bravest and most noble sons. Their actions and sacrifice were truly part and parcel of the heirloom that Mississippi handed down to her sons. Later today, I look forward to the opportunity of showing you the ground on which these gallant Mississippians fought and died. Thank you.
What I need to see, Parker and Terry and Ruth Ann and Mitch